going to have a look at a message titled The Importance of History to the Future of the New Zealand Mission. And like most messages I give, I'm not interested in giving you one nice little message. I want to cover a myriad of things to paint a picture of what we could potentially learn, but also of its relevance. We have two histories in New Zealand that are particularly important. One is the bicultural history, the other is the values history, and I'm going to speak into both of those. But to begin, because it's going to be eclectic, we have an amazing history as a nation. The New Zealand mission story is one of the most amazing mission stories that exists in mission history. Because the ideal of a mission movement is that someone comes to a country, learns the language, learns the culture of the people they're reaching out to, communicates the message in a way that makes sense, and they adopt it as their own, within their own language and their own culture, and they spread it. And that's exactly what happened in the New Zealand mission. An incredible story, to the point you would have heard of certainly 2/3 of New Zealand, of all Māori, having embraced the Christian faith by the 1860s. Some would go as high as 80% or more, but conservatively 2/3 is generally accepted. The missionaries didn't come to New Zealand because they just wanted to convert it and decided to come. They waited for an invitation. The New Zealand mission was delayed for this reason. Te Pahi extended an invitation. He was unjustly killed. Samuel Marsden developed a relationship with a young chief named Ruatara. Long story short, the invitation was placed. And then Ruatara and two other chiefs, Hongi Hika and Korokoro, hopped on a ship to go to Australia to collect Marsden, to bring him back. It was a truly first invited Pākehā settlement and a true invitation to the gospel. 3 families, the Kings, the Kendalls and the Halls, came and stayed here. The criticism against the early missionaries that they're there just to convert the heathen actually, interestingly, doesn't sit well. The first sentence of mission reports would always say, we're here to convert the heathen. That's what you're supposed to say in a mission report. But what was actually happening in the writing backwards and forwards was a lot of criticism toward Marsden, because he wasn't really a big preacher of the gospel. Marsden, in the I'll give you new terms so we don't misunderstand. Many churches would say, we need to engage in community ministry and showing love before we share the gospel. So they know us by our works before they hear our message, so it makes sense. In Old English, the way to say the same thing was, we civilize before Christianize. And Marsden was a firm believer in it. Civilize didn't mean knives and forks and shoes. To civilize, in Marsden's view, meant what he did. Look at his actions. He bought a ship to enable the New Zealand mission because of the dishonesty of sailors. There's some stories behind why that happened. They had trees, but didn't have the metal tools needed to really do carpentry with them. So he taught them blacksmithing. He gifted them tools. He taught carpentry. They had a very limited food supply. So he introduced them to the farming of new crops and taught them how to farm those crops and gifted them crops at his own expense. They had a very limited meat supply. You'd appreciate there were only birds here originally. So he introduced sheep and cows to New Zealand. He taught Māori animal husbandry, how to look after these animals and how to farm them. He introduced all manner of fruit trees to New Zealand. Every one of these things wasn't sold to Māori. He wasn't a trader. He gifted them to Māori out of benevolence to try and lift them and to increase their ability to trade and to protect their own mana in their trading with the people who were here, the others, the whalers, sealers and traders, who were here for a profit and for themselves. It wasn't until the arrival of Henry Williams that things really began to change. Henry Williams was a Navy man, as also was Hobson. He'd been in the Napoleonic Wars. He'd seen enough bloodshed for a few lifetimes. It's rumoured he might have been a pacifist. His behaviour certainly fits that. He decided to do something for the Lord. He arrives and discovers that Māori are still killing each other, eating each other. There's human sacrifice, there's infanticide, there's all sorts of superstitions that end in death. And he thinks, surely the gospel of peace is relevant here. We should actually be preaching the gospel. The first Christian convert recognised by the Europeans as a genuine Māori convert wasn't until 12 or 14 years after the missionaries were first here. It's a big gap. Which is to say, Māori weren't dumb enough just to hear a message and believe it because they were gullible. They watched the lives of the missionaries. They considered their message. And when they were ready and convinced that it might be true, they began to embrace it for themselves. Christian Rangi was the first convert. But before long, Māori were beginning to embrace that gospel of peace. Henry Williams, by the way, was an absolute legend. He would walk across battlefields with Māori fighting each other in the musket wars without ever taking cover. He was a demigod. Never got hit, yelling at Māori, you put your weapons down. This isn't the way of God. It says to love your enemies. I thought you guys should kind of be the same people anyway. There's a new world coming. He was amazing. Māori then began to spread the gospel themselves. The Te Rore story is famed. It's really the story of her dad, Ngā Kuku. It was his daughter who was murdered. It was his gospel of Luke that was stolen. The gospel finds its way down through the peace that he makes with those who killed her, down to Rotorua. And then the missionaries begin to preach that slavery is wrong. And so Ngā Puhi, embracing this concept, release their slaves who have seen the life and example and heard the message of the missionaries. A number of them go to the mission stations and continue to learn. Some of them go on mission trips across to other Pacific islands, engaging in mission themselves before finally travelling home. And so the gospel begins to go to different parts of New Zealand well ahead of any missionary, because Māori like Pilipi Taumata Rakuta take it to the east coast. It is Mataho, also known as Ripaho, who comes through, and he's at Rotorua, and then down in the Kapiti where they say we want scriptures, and they send and find Ngā Kuku's Bible and bring it down there. It was Minarapa Rangi Hatuake who takes it down through Taranaki to discover his people were living down in Kapiti and helps the gospel get down there, resulting in the first church built down in the Wellington region. The patterns of war ended, the cannibalism ended, the human sacrifice ended, the various superstitions that resulted in violence and death and other things ended. It was incredible. And then the Treaty of Waitangi came about, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, an absolutely profound document as a result of these radical missionaries who weren't the beachhead for colonisation, they were anti-colonialistic. They'd come out of the same Clapham sect movement that hated slavery. What was colonisation? It was to make a slave of a person while they stood on their own land, by ripping their land, their language, their industry, their sense of identity, their culture, their language off them. They were anti-colonialistic. They wanted to stop colonisation. And so they conspired with their evangelical Christian cohorts in the colonial office in England with the missionaries on the ground in New Zealand. And so you've got the likes of James Stephens, who penned most of the thoughts found in Te Tiriti. You've got Lord Glenelg, and then you've got Lord Normanby, who commissions Hobson because he is a man who is uncompromising to come to New Zealand because there's a problem. New Zealand's opened for limited colonisation. The colonisation is happening. What can we do? The commission to Hobson is you must stop this disaster, but if not possible, to mitigate it. He's referring to the disaster of colonisation. Stop it if you can. But if you can't, do whatever you can to mitigate, to lessen the blow of this, to help protect Māori. The treaty is amazing. The treaty was betrayed. It's a devastating story. But my point is very simply that a story like the one I've just told you is pretty important. Because if Christianity is an imposition of colonisation, it has no place here. But if Christianity was genuinely invited and embraced by Māori and spread by Māori, then Christianity is rightfully here. History is important to mission. I showed you earlier on some of the feedback that we have from the Hope Project. Our social media has a whole mix of people, about 600,000 engagements sitting in there at Easter, about 400,000 at Christmas. Just so that you know, I want to encourage you today. Here's what the atheists and the non-Christians think of you. You are claiming pagan holidays like Christmas for yourself. All religions borrow from pagan myths. God doesn't exist. It's just a story that can't be proved. The Bible stories are fairy tales. The Bible isn't true. You religious people are imposing your beliefs and your festivals on people. One non-believer commented under that, if you think that's the case, why don't you stop taking a public holiday at Christmas and go back to work? I liked that. Christianity controls people with fear and lies. Churches are about corrupt power and money. Christians are deluded sheep who don't have any reason or logic, who believe fables. You've killed millions and you've taken lands. There you go. Be encouraged today. Be encouraged. Woo! Okay, here's what Christians say. Christmas is pagan, and Christians shouldn't celebrate it. Santa Claus is like Satan. Same letters. Hope Project is terrible with all of its strap lines. My goodness. Aroha, the reason for the season, with a picture of baby Jesus. It's not Aroha that's the reason for the season, it's Jesus. It's a communication tool though, isn't it? Right, you're talking to a non-church audience. How are you going to slap that in their face? Our TV ad, to point it out, never says Jesus. All the imagery is Jesus. It's a poem. And it begs the question, who is this talking about? And the non-believer sitting in their lounge says, Jesus. Jesus is in it, but it's put together with wisdom to make them say it, not you, because you're appealing to an audience that could be hostile. So kind of missing the point, right? Here's some Easter stuff. Common objections. Christianity is an irrelevance. The Bible supports slavery. Slavery's wrong, and that makes me as an atheist superior to you as a Christian. Catch that as an argument. By the way, Christianity is the only thing that's ever challenged and stopped slavery, and it's because of the Bible. Right? Easter has nothing to do with Jesus, which is strange, given that our government made Easter and Christmas public holidays to remember the birth, death, and resurrection of him. Religions are the cause of most of the world's wars, which isn't actually true. And by the way, atheism killed more people last century than all religions combined the last 2,000 years. And Christianity brings discrimination. We'd be better off without it. The whole tolerance movement, the discrimination and the equality movement is entirely from the church, in case you're not aware. How are we going to answer these questions? This is what people are thinking. The hostility toward us is growing because public media tell the bad stories and don't tell the good stories. And what I worked out this year, after a few years of doing this, is that the replies we put in, which are very effective in these conversations when it's got gentleness and story to it, 2/3 of those objections can only be answered with a story from history. I'll say it again. You can have all the knowledge of the Bible you like, quote 1,000 verses and all that kind of stuff. If you don't have story, you can't answer those questions. History is more important than we think. Let's jump to the scriptures. My people, hear my teachings, listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with parables. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders that he has done. This scripture goes on to talk about 20 things that God had done in the life of Israel. Coming through the desert, the waters parting, the manna bread from heaven, the water out of a rock. Magnificent stories. What I want to suggest to you is that these aren't the stories we should be going out to tell the world. To do so might miss something of the point of this whole chapter, which says that we should tell people, the next generation, the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord and of the wonders he has done. Because if you go out and talk about Moses going through the Red Sea, someone will say, what relevance is that to us? We live in New Zealand. Man, it was probably 4,000 years ago. And they'd actually be right. What about talking about how the gospel arrived in New Zealand? What about talking about the transformation to Māori? This is the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. What about how this became one of the most free, prosperous, and equality-based societies in the world today and in all of human history? That's a story to tell, and Jesus sits square at the center of that one. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 6. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and your children after them may fear the Lord, your God, as long as you live by keeping all the decrees and commands. So we're supposed to be passing on the heritage of faith that we have. Then it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, the command. And then it says to parents, these commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them upon your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on the doorframes of your house and on your gates. The modern translation of all of this would say, impress them upon your children. Talk about them when you drive them to the sports practice and when you drive them to youth group and when you're driving them back from school, right? You get what I'm saying? Talk about them when you're reading them bedtime stories, but also when you're at the breakfast table at the start of the day. You could tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads if you like, but weird. I wouldn't do that. Write them on the door frames. We use that to measure how tall our children are. We don't write scriptures on the door frames. That's weird, but we do have posters and pieces of art that symbolize things. We have actually, we've got some things made of wood from different countries we've been to that help remember stories. You see, the history that we're supposed to tell by every means possible is the history of what God has done. This is how faith is imparted. How is culture handed from one generation to the next? Culture is imparted through the stories and the traditions. So what about telling our young people and people in our churches about the history of our church movements? Because these are remarkable stories. And I think there's people in our churches who don't even know them. What about the stories of our local church? How did this building get here? Who purchased the land? Must have cost a bit of money to build this. How did that happen? What did they think God had called this particular church to do? We've got an amazing story in the church that I'm in, and for the sake of time, I won't give it all to you. But a guy felt the Lord say, build a church on that piece of orchard over the road, and went over and asked for it and got it for a really small price. And then when we asked about the deposit, said, we don't have any money, and asked the guy selling it to him to loan him the money. And got the piece of land and built a church, which 30 years later has just had a refurbishment, but the bones of it are all still the basic structure of that building. It was a very good build. But it was a miracle, the way that all of that came together. That builds faith. And the young people, the children and the adults, every time they walk in the building and begin to understand, they're standing in the heritage of somebody else's faith story. This is how culture is passed on. What about the faith stories of our whole culture, which I've already alluded to? What about the faith stories of our individual journeys? Our churches should be houses of testimony. They should be full of testimony. Every person in this room doesn't just have one testimony of the Lord's goodness. We have multiple. The saints overcame, what? By the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. It's about telling the story of the things that God has done. And the remarkable thing is that children love hearing stories. They'll be excited about what the Lord has done if they hear stories relevant to them. Not just stories from, 4,000 years ago or something, but also stories from recent history. And in case we didn't notice it, youth love hearing stories, and adults love hearing stories. We did daily Bible readings and stories with the kids because we've got a son who's rather easily distracted. He's got learning and behavioural challenges. We started early on doing what we called Bible stories in the dark. If the lights were on, you'd never get through a Bible story. So I'd sometimes have my phone, sometimes not. But if you do a Bible story a day, it's a lot of space for Bible stories. You can only tell David and Goliath so many times. And so I've given our kids all the weird Bible stories that you wouldn't get in a children's book as well. But we've been through that, and I remember reaching a point where I thought, you know what, I'm just giving them all these stories that they could imagine to be imaginary stories from, thousands of years ago. You hear what I'm saying? So I thought, okay, instead of just Bible stories, we're going to be talking about the story of God. So I started to tell my children the story of God. So I started to tell them about New Zealand history. I started to tell them about how my wife and I got together, and we started to talk about challenges of our lives or things we'd experienced in ministry or stepping out in faith and things and how the Lord had provided, so they would begin to learn faith, because faith is imparted through story. Culture is preserved through story. When the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them to take 12 stones from the place where they stand in the middle of the Jordan, carry them to a pile to the side where you're going to camp tonight. So Joshua called together 12 men, and they did exactly what he had that they were told to do. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean? Then you will tell them they remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing where the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. So are we supposed to take all of our children on a pilgrimage to Israel so they can walk past the stones and then potentially say, what do these stones mean? See, what's the relevance of this scripture to us? How about the idea that we need to build memorials to the great things that the Lord has done? And there are certainly great things that the Lord did in Israel. Let's talk about that. But there are great things that the Lord did in New Zealand. What about talking about that as the work of God, as the application of the Word of God? We have a memorial in our house. It's a photo of my wife and I on our wedding day. And it's not there to make us feel bad about how good we looked then compared to now. It's there as, guess what? It's a memorial, isn't it? To remember that that day was special, and we're going to honour what that day represented. Why do we do that? Why do we put pictures of ourselves looking younger and more beautiful, right? Yeah. Christmas, Easter, Waitangi Day, Anzac Day. These are memorials. And Christ can be intrinsic to every one of those. Christ is specifically the reason for 3 of those, Christmas, Easter, and Waitangi Day. We take our children to the Anzac Day dawn service in Tauranga every time we're there, unless we're at Waitangi or somewhere else. It's sad how many children aren't there. It's sad that the Christian church still hasn't overpopulated that event so the venue doesn't work. It's a shame. The Christian church is, however, the majority of the attendance, even better than Māori. That's to our credit. But everybody should have their children there, I reckon. What's Waitangi Day about? It's a memorial. And Christ is central to that. Let our kids know the story. Make an event out of it. We sit at the beach, we watch the sunrise, everything's going down there. You've got the Ratana band who are absolutely awesome. I love the Ratana band. You've got all the people doing their speeches and some poor MC trying to keep everybody short. You take your kids out for a special feed afterwards. They sit there with their flasks of hot Milo with blankets and cushions throughout it. They read a book, they listen. They do what they like. But they're part of it, and the story is told. The heritage is there. The culture is preserved. Winston Churchill. One of the signs of a great society is the diligence with which it passes culture from one generation to the next. This culture is the embodiment of everything that the people of that society hold dear. When one generation no longer esteems its own heritage and fails to pass the torch to its children, it is saying in essence that the very foundation, principles and experiences that make the society what it is are no longer valid. This is what our nation has done. For about 60 years at least, we have failed to pass on the stories of our own culture. People who are smart have done this deliberately, because if you can hide people from their own cultural heritage, then they don't know who they are. That makes them malleable. Then you come in and you tell them who you say they are, and they believe you because they have no argument against it. The stories of history are really, really important. They embody who we are. They embody our values. And in a society where people might want to change us to be something we're not, I've been speaking a message, the rebranding of New Zealand, for a decade now. It's not Christians who are rebranding New Zealand. It's people in the public square. We need to wake up to what's happening and work out how to respond. How do we respond? We've got to tell the story. Here's what Winston Churchill says. What is required when this happens, and a society has lost its way, is for leaders to arise who have not forgotten the discarded legacy and who love it with all of their hearts. You see, you can preserve culture, you can restore culture by telling the stories of history. New Zealand's history is significantly Christian. Retelling the story, I am suggesting to you, is not just a key strategy for the future of the New Zealand mission. We cannot defend our freedoms in the public square without the story, which validates who we are. See, a couple of simple statements. Those who tell the history write the future. Because when you tell the history, you're telling people who they are. And not all history is of the same relevance. What my grandparents were eating for breakfast in the 1930s is part of New Zealand's history. But you don't need to read about that. It's not particularly important. But there are things that happened in our history, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was an outreach organisation and standing for women's right, supported by multiple pulpits who began to preach on the equality of women. Things like that are pretty important stories. And especially in view of a third wave of feminism, which sees Christianity as the opposition, when feminism wouldn't exist but for Christianity. The first wave is specifically from us. The second wave is our values adopted by people who don't have personal faith, but still in line with Christian values. The third wave, well, if anyone can tell me what it is, I don't think anyone actually has a definition of what the third wave is. But the other statement is important. Those who control the present control the past. If you've studied or looked at all of what's happening in the New Zealand history curriculum, those who control the present are controlling the past so they can write the future. We have to engage. We have to learn the story, and we have to tell the story. So what does secular mean? Did you know that Benedictine monks, 1,000 or however many years ago, were called secularists? They were completely Christian, but they were secularists because it means they were separate from the structured church. Did you know that at the sitting of the first New Zealand Parliament, the word secular meant to be of no particular Christian denomination? The first debate of our current Parliament was about who would open in Christian prayer. There were atheists in the room. None of them had a question we'd open in Christian prayer. We were going to be a Christian nation built on Christian values, because what's the alternative? An atheistic nation built on a principle of power? That leads to dictatorship. That's not going to work. And we didn't want to be an Islamic nation by their values, or a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Taoist. We were clearly going to be a Christian nation. No one had a problem with that. No atheist had a problem. The debate, therefore, was about who would open in prayer. And the specific reason for that is because the Anglican Church was married to the state in England. So if you let an Anglican open in prayer, that might make us an Anglican nation like England. We want a marker in the sand that says it's not just about religious freedom. Christianity breeds religious freedom. It's about a separation of denomination from state. That was the issue. So a man was sent down the street to find the first minister he could. That person was brought back to open in prayer. They just happened to be an Anglican. So we are an Anglican nation. There we go. Okay. Which means that the word secular has actually changed meanings, doesn't it? When did that happen? How did that happen? We're a secular nation and Christianity is supposed to be quiet. Okay. That's a pretty important story from history. You see, take a look at New Zealand and its so-called Western values. Our value of human life, which is the original thought from which most of the others here are seeded. The equality of races, the end of slavery, democratic forms of government, ideas about human rights, the freedoms of information, conscience, speech, religion, equality of genders, concepts of charity, education for all, including the poor is the point there, healthcare for all, public healthcare system rather than just healthcare for the rich in their homes because they have enough money. Where did these values come from? Are these really European values? No, they're not. And there's a growing movement, I've been talking for a number of years, about post-secularism. Let's frame it differently. There are people in Europe who look at their history, like historian Tom Holland, and say, I've looked at and I've studied for decades the history of my forefathers culturally, the Greeks and the Romans. I have worked out that I have hardly a thing in common with them. In fact, I've realized over the years that I detest them. Their cold-heartedness, their complete lack of charity, their barbarism, their intolerance, their discrimination, their hatred, the violence, the murder, which is just allowed. Paedophilia. Do you really think societies in this world have had a problem with paedophilia? It's a horrendous sin. But you can only say that if you're in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Paedophilia has been standard and common to most societies through history and justified. What do you think a slave is? They are the possession of their owner. What do you think a slave who is a child is? They are the possession of their owner. What do you think happens in a male-dominated society with slavery? This is standard. So when did we decide that stopping paedophilia was necessary? Well, thank you to William Booth in the 1800s. Can you believe it took that long? Christianity was opposed to it right throughout, but it took that long for Christianity to gain enough influence to influence a whole society. An age of minimum consent was set at age 14 as a result of William Booth, the Salvation Army guy, campaigning. And in New Zealand, it came about in the early 1900s as a result of the Women's Christian Temperance Union campaigning for the same age 14. Christianity has changed the world. And Tom Holland had to look at it, this is why he's quoted in the recent Hope Project booklet, and say, actually, I've worked out I, as a European, have pretty much nothing in common with my cultural ancestors. So what does that make me? Well, as an atheistic secularist or an agnostic secularist, I am Christian. He's not saying I am a Christian, but he's saying I am Christian. That is the fundamental value system. And if you lose that, what have you got? We've got to understand what's going on in our culture, and we've got to learn the story and feed this conversation. Look again at Richard Dawkins. I've spoken about him on the topic numerous times. He's one of the most vocal opponents to Christianity, and yet he has suggested that Christianity might yet be the hope for England. He doesn't like Christianity, yet he has lamented the demise of Christianity inasmuch as it might have been a bulwark, a restraining wall against something worse. Bible in schools is over, right? Surely the atheists are against it. No, Richard Dawkins says we need this. Because without an understanding of basic Bible stories, our children have no lens or framework from which to understand so much of our history. And while Dawkins didn't state it, what is our history? Well, it's the story that defines our values and our culture, isn't it? We have church leaders who outrightly say this is a secular nation, not a Christian nation. We have denominational leaders and organizational leaders who say it, while we have secular academics recognizing that they are Christian. They're not Christians by faith, but they are Christian by values and by culture. How important might this story be? We need to learn and tell the stories. So to make this practical and to land this, here we go. Hope Project booklets have been created with an awareness of this as part of our organisation's goals to try and revive an interest in the bicultural history and in the values history of New Zealand. And what I would like to ask you each to do is a favour for me. I would like you to be obedient and in a break to take one copy of each Hope Project booklet from the back. And the purpose is that we have in them around about 40 to 50 different cultural stories. These are New Zealand's history. This is our history, and that is the easiest, most accessible resource you will be able to find on a whole lot of the core history stories of our nation. It includes bicultural history type stories, but it includes values. King Alfred the Great is significant to who we are as a nation. What he did in 890 is fundamental in making the Ten Commandments and Jesus' law of love the foundation for British law. That changed the course of British history. The Magna Carta comes because of that. Our freedoms that we have in New Zealand today come as a result of that. It's a case of learning the blessings we have as one of the most free, prosperous nations in the world. You see, the list of things that we looked at before weren't European values. That was my point. They were actually Jesus' values. And the story I forgot to tell you was about the UN. Because the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is a Christian document, and I bet you've never heard that before. Penned by Eleanor Roosevelt, a devout Christian. The wife of the late President Roosevelt of America. There was a committee with people of different faiths involved, but she was delighted to be able to bring Christian values to the world, simply remove the word God. The fact that it is a Christian document is quite easily evidenced in numerous ways. You cannot say that people have human rights if they aren't intrinsically special as compared to an animal. None of it makes a rational sense without God. But also the Muslims weren't so dumb as to believe that that was an international declaration of human rights for all people. They knew it was a Christian document, which is why in 2002 they created the Cairo Declaration, which is an Islamic declaration of human rights, which includes various things our society would disagree with, including the rights of husbands to beat their wives and various other things, fitting with Sharia law and their culture and what they perceive to be a human right. And it is in this context, catch this, one secular historian has even said, secularism is but a footnote to the Bible. Catch that as a thought. That's a mind blower. Poverty across the world was reduced insanely in the previous 20 years. How did that happen? The United Nations applying what? Capitalistic free market economy principles in poorer nations. When capitalism comes to a nation, guess what? The rich can get richer, but the poor get richer. When socialism comes to a nation, guess what? The rich and an elite still get richer, but the poor get poorer. Christianity and its values through the UN have done incredible good within this world. We are a part of an amazing faith heritage. We need to tell our story. Please get a copy of each of the Hope Project booklets. At hopeproject.co.nz, I've also been creating a radio series, you've heard it on Rima Media possibly, with 1 minute in history thoughts. So if you go, there's 3 types of content there. One of them is Christian Hope. And if you go to that, there's panels. And if you click the one that says a minute in history, you'll find a collection of a whole lot of 1 minute radio thoughts. Now these are the same thoughts that Life FM, Southern Star and Radio Rima play. And I'll just skip through those. And also, you will find there's a bibliography of the most easily accessible resources on our bicultural and values history. That bibliography sits inside that publication. We do one a year on outreach, on strategic things. So that's over at the desk. You can have a copy quickly of that bibliography, and the New Zealand history stories over there are obviously a part of that. To finish, I'll read this quote, and then Kristen, please come. One of the signs of a great society is the diligence with which it passes culture from one generation to the next. This culture is the embodiment of everything that the people of that society hold dear. When one generation no longer esteems its own heritage and fails to pass the torch to its children, it is saying in essence that the very foundation principles and experiences that make the society what it is are no longer valid. What is required when this happens and the society has lost its way is for leaders to arise who have not forgotten the discarded legacy and who love it with all their hearts. Father, help us to become a people who would know our story. Not just the story of our faith, which does go back through the Jewish tradition into the scriptures, but also the story of faith that rests in the works of men and women who are our own cultural ancestors here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Through a history in Europe in which the gospel profoundly impacted Europe to see their value system changed, which influenced who we are, bringing prosperity, equality and freedom. but also through the arrival of the gospel amongst Māori, which brought a transformation to the violent excesses of their own culture, bringing about another amazing story, even though it's a story that was later betrayed. Help us tell this story. Help New Zealanders discover afresh the amazing nation that we are, which is intrinsically what it is because of the things that you have done. May you be glorified. May space for your name be preserved within this nation. We ask in Jesus' name.